Okay, so in this video, what we're going to do is kind of do a quick look back at time period 3 and the end of time period 3 and look forward into time period 4 through art movement. So we're going to look at the art movements of the late 19th century into the 20th century. And what we'll do by doing this is kind of do a quick recap of what was going on at the end of the 19th century as a way to get us ready for what's going to happen in the 20th century and all of the awfulness that happens in the 20th century. So we're going to pick up this story with the invention of maybe the most revolutionary instrument in art, and that is the camera. So the most important change invention of the camera. The camera is the most important invention, or most revolutionary invention, in the art world. And the reason for that is that the camera is a much better recorder of reality than a painting. You can very easily capture what's going on with a camera than you can with a painting. It's faster, it's way more accurate than a painting can ever be. And so artists kind of leave the recording of reality to photographers, and painting is going to become a more expressive art form. And so starting around the late 1800s, like the 1870s and 1880s, when the camera is becoming a more prevalent instrument, we start to see some of the first new expressive painting movements. And so we're going to look first at Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. And these kind of take place between the 1870s and maybe like the early 1900s. The other odd thing about Impressionism and Post-Impressionism is that even though Post-Impressionism kind of implies that it comes after Impressionism, they're kind of happening around the same time. So Impressionism is basically what the name implies. Impressionism is designed to give you an impression of how the artist viewed the subject of the painting. So it does still, it still reflects the reality of what the artist sees. So we're going to see real things. So it's still kind of tied to realism in that regard. So it's still tied to realism. It's still showing you what they're seeing. But the artist and plays with the light and the color and the brush strokes to kind of make it look like a memory or a dream, or, as the name implies, an impression of the thing. So there are two important Impressionist painters that I'm going to show you a couple examples of here. The first one is Edouard Manet. The other guy is Claude Monet. So Manet and Monet. And I picked these two because they're easy to remember, Manet and Monet. So I'm going to show you a couple examples of these. I'll try to give you the titles of them as well, but pretty much as long as you know maybe a painting and a name, you should be good. So this is a Manet, and this is called Luncheon on the Grass, and you can see it there in the bottom of the screen. Now, this one was kind of the first Impressionist painting. And at the time when this was exhibited in 1863, it was a scandal. And you'll probably see why when I pull it up on the screen. So here's the painting. And the thing that was scandalous about this is not that there is a nude figure in the painting. That's pretty common. What is scandalous is that you have a nude figure sitting amongst clothed figures. That was the weird thing, and this was very scandalous, even though he's painting a realistic image. This was something you might see out in the countryside. So this painting was scandalous. It wasn't allowed to be exhibited in any of the museums in Paris. That was until our old friend Napoleon III started hearing about these paintings and said, well, let's let the public decide. And all of these paintings that were kind of in this Impressionist school were finally allowed to be seen by the public. And even though the artists and the art critics didn't like it, the people thought it was good. And so because the people liked it, it was allowed to be exhibited. You start to see more and more of this kind of painting. Here is another one. So this one is called The Bar at the Folies Bergère. And again, regular life, but it's kind of got this kind of dreamlike quality. You don't see like hard lines in this. It's meant to be kind of fluid looking. This is also one of the first paintings, if not the first painting, to have labels on bottles. So this was actually maybe one of the first advertisements. So this is the bar at this was 1882. Okay, so those are two Manets. Here are a couple of Monets. This one is something that Monet was famous for. Monet painted a lot of water lilies later in his life, and so he painted a lot. He's famous for his water lilies. So again, it's a real thing. You can see that they're water lilies, but there's kind of this light, dreamlike, airy quality to it. So if you can remember Monet and the water lilies, that's probably sufficient for this. This one is a painting that Monet painted, and it actually gave the art movement its name. This is called Impression. And again, it's real life, just like realism was, but again, it's kind of a memory of it. It's a hazy kind of view of fishermen. So this one is called Impression. And I want to say this is 1872. I think that's what he painted down here in the corner. Okay, so that's Impressionism. So let's talk about Post-Impressionism. Now, Post-Impressionism, like I said before, kind of happens at the same time as Impressionism. Post-Impressionism is a reaction to Impressionism, but it's not a unified reaction. Post-Impressionism is not a unified school in art. There were lots of different ways of reacting to Impressionism. So, for example, this guy, Paul Cézanne, liked what the artists were doing in terms of light and color, but he wanted to go back to the dark, distinguished lines of neoclassical art. So he reacted by trying to put some structure back into Impressionism. And he did that through the use of geometric shapes. And we can see that if we look at a couple of his paintings. So this one is called The Card Players. So it's still got that kind of light, airy quality to it, but it looks more defined. And there are a lot of very specific geometric figures, like a triangle and a square and rectangles. Here's another one by Cézanne. I think this was in 1905. This one is called The Bathers. And in this one, you see a lot of circles, a lot of round figures. So Cézanne is trying to kind of impose a little bit of order on what Impressionism is trying to do. The other end of this spectrum is maybe the more famous of the post-impressionists, Vincent van Gogh. Now, Van Gogh goes in the other direction. He doesn't even want to stick to the realism part of it. He wants to be more expressive. So he reacts by being even more expressive. He thought Impressionism didn't go enough, and we see that in Van Gogh's art. So this is called The Night Cafe, which again still looks like a real thing, but now we're starting to see him play with what exactly we're seeing. Like, obviously this is a cafe, but you see like the light around the lights, and that's not real. The shadow of this pool table is much bigger than you would expect, so you see a lot more of Van Gogh in this than just the cafe. Van Gogh is kind of giving you how he's interpreting the cafe. And I wouldn't be very good at this if I didn't give you Van Gogh's most famous painting, The Starry Night. Again, this is his interpretation of a starry night. Again, it's a real image. You could probably go find this view, but the way he's viewing the stars is giving you his impression of it. This is going in the opposite direction of what Cézanne is doing. Okay, so that kind of takes us up to World War I. And World War I was kind of the earth-shattering event in European politics and society and culture, and art was no different. And so World War I radically altered how art was viewed and what its purpose was. So philosophically, after World War I, ideas like nihilism and existentialism become popular philosophies. And we've covered these before, but basically the point of nihilism and existentialism is that life is meaningless. And for a lot of people after World War I, it pretty much stopped right there. Life is meaningless. The war was pointless. So many people died. For what? For nothing. The other side of this is that you have to give life meaning for yourself. So it's up to you to give your life meaning. And we see this in the art. Now, some of the art movements that happen right after World War I are things like Dadaism. Dadaism is basically meaningless art. It's art that doesn't serve a purpose. So Dada was just a made-up word. Dada is meaningless. And so Dadaist art is also meaningless. Which means you yourself give it meaning. So, for example, this is a very famous piece of Dadaist art. So this is by Marcel Duchamp. And it's simply called Fountain. It's a urinal, but he signed his name to it, which isn't actually his name. He signed it R. Mutt, but it was by Duchamp, and he says this is art because he says it's art. Another really important genre or medium of Dadaist art was in collage. And here is a Dadaist collage. It's just a bunch of pictures that were cut out of magazines and put together. I'm not going to write this down because it's a really, really long title, but it's by a guy named Helmut Hoch. And it's called cut with the kitchen knife through the last epoch of Weimar beer belly culture in Germany. It doesn't have a meaning. Whatever you see in this is the meaning of the art. Another important art movement that comes out of the post-World War I experience is this movement called Art Brut. Art Brut is art of the untrained. So this is art of the children, peasants. There was a large segment of people who followed Art Brut that looked at the art of the mentally ill. So there was a whole subgenre of Art Brut for people who were in insane asylums. And the point of this is that science and progress and education gave us World War I. And so how good is science and progress and education? The real stuff comes through the uneducated. So one of the proponents of this was a French artist named Jean Dubuffet. And he himself was an artist, but he liked to create art in this style. And so here is a Jean Dubuffet. It's meant to be as if a child were to draw it. So this is called the Grand Matre of the Outsider. Another important art movement of the period was Surrealism. Surrealism is meant to kind of put juxtaposed images together to create
Good afternoon, teachers and staff. If you happen to still be on campus, please make sure that you're making your way off campus by 3:30 so that the custodial staff can clean up and lock up. Thank you.
So to put juxtaposed images together to create kind of an unsettled effect. And maybe the most famous of these guys is Salvador Dali. So Surrealists were explicitly political. And most of them were communists because they saw art as capitalist and bourgeois. And so they're doing this to kind of break people away. So if we look at a piece of surrealistic art, here is a Dali. This is called Geopoliticus, or a child watching the birth of a new man. So it's kind of unsettling. So here's the name of this one. So that's a Dali. Now, the big break in Surrealism happened when Dali sided with the kind of proto-fascists in the Spanish Civil War. So he kind of breaks with the rest of the Surrealists who were still pretty explicitly communist. And Dali sides with the proto-fascists and the monarchists in the Spanish Civil War, and that takes us down a path that we'll cover a little bit more when we get to the Spanish Civil War. The most important 20th century artist is probably Pablo Picasso. And he bridges the gap between the surrealistic stuff and the more modern art. So he started painting in the 1880s, doing like neoclassical art. And then in the 1900s, he kind of, or we'll call it the 1920s, he starts painting surrealistic stuff. And then as we get into the 1930s, he's going to be one of the founders of a type of art called Cubism. Now, what Cubism does is it takes geometric shapes, and instead of incorporating them into the painting like Cézanne did, it just keeps the shapes. So the most famous of the Picassos, and maybe the most famous painting of the 20th century, is Guernica. So Guernica was painted in 1937, and here it is. So this is Picasso's masterpiece, and it's meant to be unsettling. So it's got some surrealist qualities to it. It's also got cubist qualities to it, and that a lot of these figures are just geometric shapes. But there's also a political message in here too, because what this is it's depicting the German bombing of a Spanish city during the Spanish Civil War. And we'll talk more about the Spanish Civil War when we get to it, but this is Picasso's reaction to the Spanish Civil War. Now, as we move into the later half of the 20th century, the Cold War gives us our last big shift in art. And there are three art movements that I'm going to just very briefly talk about because they're kind of divided amongst Eastern Europe and Western Europe. So we'll look at the Western art movements first. So one of these is called abstract expressionism. And abstract expressionists are basically painting movement. Now, we've talked about art that kind of tries to make you feel like there's some movement going on. That was one of the ideas of Romanticism. It was one of the ideas of Baroque art. But this is literally painting movement. Like, you're not really looking at the finished work. What you're trying to see is the actual movement of making the art. So, for instance, this one. This is a Jackson Pollock. He's probably the most famous abstract expressionist. And basically, all he did was he kind of hovered over a canvas in a sling and just painted, just let the paint drip where it went. And so you're not looking at the finished thing. What you want to see is how he made it. Now, this art really reflects the freedom of expression in the West. The other art movement in Western Europe and the Western world is what's called pop art. And what pop art does is it kind of looks at Western society through a more cynical view. And it looks at things like advertisements and comic books as methods of consumption. Like, that's what makes capitalism work, is consumption. And so this is the art of capitalism. So two names kind of to associate with pop art. Andy Warhol, and he's famous for, among other things, the Campbell's soup. So it just adds just an ad of Campbell's soup, just over and over and over again. The other name is Roy Lichtenstein. And he blew up giant panels from like the Sunday morning comics. This one's just called Blam. But again, it's talking about consumption and how that's needed in capitalism. So we've got two different ideas of Western society. One, highlighting the freedom of expression. The other kind of talking about how consumerism needs advertisement and people buying things to make this work. In Eastern Europe, this is very easy to understand. In Eastern Europe, we have one art movement, and it's called Socialist Realism. And it's basically just communist or Soviet propaganda. It was super easy to understand. It was very straightforward. There was no questioning it. And the point of it was to promote the proletariat. And we will talk more about promoting the proletariat when we talk about Stalinism. But just to give you an idea of what it looks like, this is what it looks like. Very straightforward, super realistic. It just says, we will meet the party's demands. We will meet the party's goals. That's what it says. So again, what we're seeing here is the Cold War. So hopefully, by doing all of this discussion of art, a very quick discussion of art, we've hit a lot of the things that we're going to do in time period 4. So we're going to hit World War I and all of the awfulness of World War I and how we started to question what we had done up to this point. We're going to get into World War II because the Spanish Civil War is kind of a prologue to the horrors of World War II, and then we're going to get into the Cold War and the two differing sides of the Cold War. And hopefully by looking at the art, you've got an idea of where we're going and why we're going there. So until the next time, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.